There's a certain slant of light, winter afternoons, that oppresses like the heft of cathedral tunes. Heavenly hurt it gives us. We can find no scar, but internal difference where the meanings are. None may teach it, any. 'Tis the seal despair, an imperial affliction, sent us of the air. When it comes, the landscape listens, shadows hold their breath. When it goes, 'tis like the distance on the look of death. So one more time. There's a certain slant of light. Poem 320. There's a certain slant of light, winter afternoons, that oppresses like the heft of cathedral tunes. Heavenly hurt it gives us, we can find no scar, but internal difference where the meanings are. None may teach it, any. 'Tis the seal despair, an imperial affliction, sent us of the air. When it comes, the landscape listens, shadows hold their breath. When it goes, 'tis like the distance on the look of death. Take a comfortable seat. Find your way back in. Place your hands on your lap, palms up, if that feels comfortable. Straighten the back. Lengthen the neck a little, just a little. And relax the shoulders. Then just start to deepen the breath. Three counts in. 4 counts out. And now we're in the cathedral. You've been to one of those Romanesque or Gothic cathedrals in Europe, or even the National Cathedral here in Washington, D.C. You walk off the street, Wisconsin Avenue. You enter that space, and the architecture itself changes your point of view. Part of you feels very small, even crushed by the hugeness of that place. St. Vitus's Cathedral in Prague, or Notre Dame. Then you're in the cathedral. A few moments or half an hour, and you begin to feel a part of that bigness. With your eyes half closed or closed, just imagine the space you're in is a space like that. The light coming down at a slant through the rose window. Pictures of suffering on the wall. Now you're the light coming through the window. You're even bigger than the cathedral now. You're shining through it. Bringing back the breath. Softening the shoulders again. Softening the muscles of the face. Shining that slanted light onto whatever pain you're experiencing in your body, or whatever worry or suffering there is. There's a certain slant of light. There's a certain slant of light, winter afternoons, that oppresses like the heft of cathedral tunes. Heavenly hurt it gives us. We can find no scar, but internal difference where the meanings are. None may teach it any. 'Tis the seal despair, an imperial affliction sent us of the air. When it comes, the landscape listens. Shadows hold their breath. When it goes, 'tis like the distance on the look of death. This poem was written, it's said, in 1861. And anyone who tells you that Emily Dickinson was a solitary poet who wrote poems in her room separate from the world only has to look at the great work that she composed between 1861 and 1865, and you'll see that she's a war poet. 1861 to 1865 was a great period of interruption in American history. And she is the poet of interruption, even though she's not writing about soldiers dying on the field, although sometimes she makes reference to those very things, but it's rare. She's writing about interruptions of the spirit. Her poems are filled with interruptions. Metrically, there are these dashes inside them that are like little hesitations, little interruptions, little moments of doubt, excuse me, little pauses, little revisions of thought all throughout her poems. And in her poems too, you see interruptions all the time. I heard a fly buzz when I died. The fly gets in between the light and me. The fly gets in between the king entering the room and me with blue, uncertain, stumbling buzz, she says. And that blueness is related to the blue devils. It's related to sadness, melancholy, and depression. And I say this because this poem is often compared to Keats's Ode on Melancholy. It's said to be a poem about melancholy because there's that word despair right there in the middle of it. 'Tis the seal despair, an imperial affliction, sent us of the air. But I just want to argue for our group something a little, maybe even radical, that it's not about despair necessarily, but it's about consciousness and the ways that suffering and consciousness are linked. I started the meditation with this image of the cathedral because this poem is filled with those kinds of interruptions. When you walk into a cathedral, you feel very small, but you also feel exalted. The point of the cathedral is to make you pay attention to that small part of yourself and then to exalt another part of yourself, which is what we would call in meditation circles, the one who's looking or the one who's watching. And to identify not with that painful why me self, but with awareness, with a feeling of presence, with that feeling of aliveness that is inherently connected to this experience of pain. All religions are talking about suffering as the first rule of life, the first noble truth, all life is suffering. And David Byrne, the Talking Heads, this ain't no party, this ain't no disco, this ain't no fooling around. This ain't no party that we enter when we enter the cathedral. And the king who enters this place is consciousness itself. So for me, this poem is about the king who enters the room. And when it comes, the landscape listens, shadows hold their breath. You see how that's working? When it comes, the landscape listens. Oh, something royal has just entered the room. Shadows hold their breath. There's this feeling of awe. And when it goes, 'tis like the distance on the look of death. Everything sort of falls back into that crouched jumping mouse position. But we're going from jumping mouse to the eagle when we identify with this king that enters the room, this slanted light that comes through the rose windows and looks at things, looks at those suffering images on the walls. It's a little pivot in our attention. So I've read critics who talk about heavenly hurt here. Heavenly hurt, it gives us, we can find no scar, but internal difference where the meanings are. And they say that the heavenly hurt comes from above, but it's a deliberate contradiction to me. It's a hurt, but it's a heavenly hurt because it's the awareness that you're alive that we're experiencing when we experience pain or when we're present with it and not running off to try to turn it off or to anesthetize ourselves with a drug or another drink or some other distraction that takes us away from this experience of being alive. I love this poem so much because it takes me right there. It took 100 years to build a cathedral, but this poem, which is 16 lines, has lasted 160 years, and it's still good. It still takes me there immediately, even though I'm not of that world, but I understand suffering and I understand pain. And it sings like a hymn is the last thing I'll say. It sings to the theme of amazing grace with its ballad stanza, its common measure, 4-3-4-3. There's a certain slant of light. There's a certain slant of light, winter afternoons, that oppresses like the heft of cathedral tunes. Heavenly hurt, it gives us, we can find no scar, but internal difference, where the meanings are. None may teach it, any. 'Tis the seal despair, an imperial affliction sent us of the air. When it comes, the landscape listens, shadows hold their breath. When it goes, 'tis like the distance on the look of death. So let's go back into the meditation for the second half, and I have a couple of questions for you. Deepening the breath. 3 counts in. 4 counts out. Four counts in. And if you're able to, let it fall to 5 counts. Is there an interruption in your life right now that's made you say, why me? Is the question. Something that's caused confusion, maybe not necessarily great pain. Nothing tragic or disastrous or even political. whatever it is, just take it by the hand and walk it into the cathedral with you. And from this feeling of confusion, can you just move slightly into a space of openness, availability to it? Just widen your field of acceptance a little bit to say, okay, there's room for you. Just smile a little bit from the heart and let the light fall on that too, that slanted light coming through the rose window. And there, with that interrupting fly in the room or whatever you're thinking about, can you experience the awe of being in the cathedral nevertheless? So from confusion to openness to awe. And then the last of these four bewilderments, as I like to call them, can you return to the why me question with a feeling of unearned grace? What is this consciousness? This is the hard problem that David Chalmers talks about. How do we know that we're alive? What is this grace? How am I the one that gets to feel this? That's the moment where the jumping mouse turns into the eagle. That's the moment where you go from having the light shining on you through the rose window to being the light shining through the rose window. Softening the shoulders, just feeling the openness of the heart. This is a real experience. This is Thich Nhat Hanh. I grew up in a time of war. There was destruction all around. Children, adults, values, a whole country. As a young person, I suffered a lot. Once the door of awareness had been opened, you can't close it. The wounds of war in me are still not all healed. There are nights I lie awake and embrace my people, my country, and the whole planet with mindful breathing. Without suffering, you can't grow. Without suffering, you can't get the peace and the joy you deserve. Please don't run away from your suffering. Embrace it and cherish it. That could be Emily Dickinson's experience to the letter. Last minute, just bringing your breath back to 3 counts in, 3 counts out. Feeling that softness in your body. There's a certain slant of light. There's a certain slant of light, winter afternoons, that oppresses like the heft of cathedral tunes. Heavenly hurt it gives us. We can find no scar, but internal difference where the meanings are. None may teach it any, 'tis the seal despair, an imperial affliction, sent us of the air. When it comes, the landscape listens. Shadows hold their breath. When it goes, 'tis like the distance on the look of death.